and dangerous. But so you want more people normally, but Deng Xiaoping imposed this one-child policy. Then I looked into how did this happen? And it turns out that it was early on when he was implementing the high growth system from Japan. The particular person who was invited to China as the key, helper with this high growth system was a very able Japanese economic planner, high growth planner of the 1960s. And in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping came to Japan, he was told by the Japanese, okay, talk to this guy. And he was our man in the 60s, now retired. He may be able to help you. And Deng Xiaoping asked him, can you please come to China soon? Like now. I need you now. 3 days later, he was in China with, there was 12, including other colleagues that he brought along. Now, who was he? His name is Okita, family name Saburo Okita. Now, by that time, he had been recruited by the Club of Rome into the Club of Rome's executive committee.
What was the club? Is the Club of Rome?
Yeah, that is a very good question. What actually is the Club of Rome? Well, it's also an institution that, this really big turning point, 1971. That's when the Club of Rome entered the world stage, so to speak.
That's the year the U.S. defaulted on its gold obligations.
Yes. With its report, The Limits to Growth. There's allegedly limits to growth. Now, of course, haven't we heard this before? I mean, this the whole degrowth movement, climate change, right. All sorts. Growth is bad and we need to limit that. Limits to growth. We've reached the limits to growth. This has basically been the story in the media ever since the Club of Rome came out with this report. So the Club of Rome was founded by, and it's not really disputed, by Rockefeller, supported by Rockefeller. Certainly in the early years, that was very clear. They met in the Rockefeller villa in Italy and, all that. And then very early on, this executive committee drafted also Mr. Okita from Japan, which is very ironic because he's the high growth expert. But the Club of Rome's two main messages were, economic growth is bad and we need to reduce it. We've reached the limits. We're going to destroy the planet, blah, blah, blah. We need low growth. And secondly, too many people on this planet. In fact, very much regurgitating the views of the East India Company leadership and its hired economist Thomas Malthus, famous for his prediction, population growth is too high. There's not enough food. We're going to starve. We need to reduce the population growth. Sometimes what you read sounds more like we need to reduce the population. And of course, that's what they did in India.
Yes.
Clearly by result, but to a large extent intentionally. Again, these are policy decisions, famines and other, taking people's livelihoods away, destroying the textile industry in India. Millions of people starved.
mRNA shots, the whole
well, that's the modern version. So this is the message of the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome drafted this high growth expert. Now, I think he was fairly innocent and he was at this stage, he was, retired, and he was called up by this, selective sort of international body that has a good reputation to be in the executive committee, and he agrees. Now, I know many Japanese people want to be very international, and this nice, famous people are there backing this, so I'll join. I don't think he was really part of the nefarious activities that are also going on, but it's clever from the Club of Rome and its backers, Rockefeller Foundation viewpoint, because he's the high growth guy. To get him in the executive committee of a club that argues for low growth, of low economic growth and low population growth, really is certainly a way of getting a handle on the high growth model and making sure that it can be suppressed in the future. That's the job of the IMF and the World Bank. For developing countries, not allowed to adopt the high growth policies. And when it comes to China, effectively, I think whether an explicit deal or just an implicit deal happened, namely Deng Xiaoping was allowed to run the high growth model, also attracted American investment. So, that was allowed to happen. But there seems to have been a required payoff, and that is to impose the one-child policy. So at least implement half of the Club of Rome agenda, and the other half, well, we'll come to that later, sort of thing. Could have been the attitude. When I looked into, so how did Deng Xiaoping adopt this one-child policy? How did it exactly happen? Turns out that he took the advice of a Chinese statistician, mathematician, who was working for the military, doing complicated ballistic calculations, so using mathematics, which is pure logic. And he was asked to do population growth trajectories. Okay. And of course they were scary. And he came to this conclusion: we need to restrict population growth. Now, the key thing is this, and I call this the great deception. He was using simulations. And if you look at, okay, what did this military statistician, mathematician, what did he use? What sort of approach, what sort of model? He used the Club of Rome model. Now, why was a Chinese sort of military-related mathematician using the Club of Rome model? Of course, it was in the West. It was propagated. It could just be by chance that he just saw the headlines in some Western publications. That's a leading model. We'll use that. Or maybe other channels to do with Rockefeller visiting China, and who knows? But we know the result, that he used, as a fact, the Club of Rome's model, which is entirely simulation. And that is a great deception, because you can make up any simulation of anything and present it. Right. But it's used to convince people and give the impression that it's factual. And this is used in economics. It's used for growth trajectories. It's used for population growth trajectories to show that it's unsustainable. And it's used, of course, for climate scenarios. And it's used for declaring pandemics, how the virus grows. It turns out it's all simulation, made up stuff. But I'll come back to this in a moment, because that's actually an interesting way of deceiving people. Fact is, okay, that's what he used, Club of Rome model simulations, and Deng Xiaoping declaring, yep, we should listen to this guy, we have no other choice.